I love you people. Thank you so much for the encouragement you've been. Our numbers just keep growing. Those cards and letters keep coming in, phone calls ringing, and all of it just so wondrously encouraging. I thank you, thank you, thank you. I thought I might begin tonight, though, by explaining something that for the second time in this series, in our 13th class, I'm going to do, with great devotion and intensity. And I might illustrate it by giving away a little bit of my years, I guess. But how many of you can remember? Now, that always happens each week. I got to get that set. There we go. How many of you remember this expression, the 3 R's? And I'm sure you've all heard it one of 2 different ways. If you're old as I am, you might remember that we rather facetiously referred to this as reading, writing, and arithmetic. So the reason we went to school was to get the 3 R's. I believe it's in more recent history, though. There's been another way of understanding these 3 R's, and that is repetition, repetition, and repetition. I've been preaching for a while, and I guess I've heard just about every criticism, constructive or otherwise, that you can imagine in decades of preaching. I've been told my hair doesn't look right. I had one man tell me I did not laugh correctly, and I spent a number of weeks trying to learn a different way to laugh until I finally decided that he was just going to have to live with it. And so I gave up, though I suppose, he really was trying to help me. But the one criticism I received the most in all my preaching is that my introductions are too long, that there's too much repetition. And I can appreciate that, I really do. I know that I maybe do spend more time on it than most folks do. But I do it very consciously, and I'm going to continue to do it, I think. I've always thought that if you just feel like this is so familiar, you could be teaching it and you could tell me how to teach it, well, then you ought to be teaching it, and we'll let other people explain to you whether or not, you're doing it right. And so I've never been discouraged by this. I know people really fully intend well. But I'm going to stick to that right side of the screen there on the 3 R's. If you really want to learn something and become the master of it, then you just have to play the scales. If you're going to be an instrumentalist, you're going to have to sing that same scale. If you're going to be a vocalist, you're sure enough going to have to climb those ladders and drive those nails. If you're going to get in construction, you need to stay with it. So let's do some repetition here this evening on what is very complex, very intricate, very elegant, I think, but very multifaceted material. We're going to have an awful lot of those bowling pins in the air, and that's why so many people can't understand Matthew 24. They just haven't mastered so many different things being kept in their minds at the same time so that they keep them all synchronized and harmonized, and they don't develop conflicts unwittingly and unknowingly so that they run off believing just about anything you can imagine. We have been looking at Matthew extensively and building our way into Matthew 24, seeing how many times Jesus has been agreeing with the Old Testament prophets that he is the one that's going to bring fire to these people. He will come after Elijah, who is John the Baptist. He will come, and then will come judgment. So in Matthew 23, he spends the whole chapter excoriating the scribes and Pharisees and summarizes it at the very end by saying, "Upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth." Now, there's no doubt about it. I've only got a segment of the verse right there. He didn't say upon you might fall that guilt, maybe would fall that guilt. He was saying that upon you will fall all the guilt of the righteous blood shed on earth. In 36, he says, all these things will come upon this generation. In verse 37, he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. In 38, he adds, behold, your house is being left to you desolate. So now I know who the subject is. In verse 35, it's the evil Jews of the first century, particularly their leaders, and they are going to pay for the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth. Much more to come on that word earth, and we'll get into it a little bit here this evening. Verse 36, we also have the time. All these things will come upon this generation. Any interpretation of this material that places it outside this generation is wrong. It's missing the point. It's arguing with Jesus. It is in rebellion against him. You are contradicting the Lord of glory. You are defying our King. Don't do that. It's going to be in this generation. Jerusalem gives us the location twice. I know the who, I know the when, I know the where, and in the last verse there that I put on the screen, I know the what. The house of Israel, the house on Mount Zion, the temple, the people that worship there, and their entire city is going to be left to them desolate. Please understand, it will be left to them desolate. It's not the end of the planet. It's not the end, the solar system, the galaxy, or the universe. The house is going to be desolated, but its desolation will remain. It's going to be left to them that way. Then in Matthew's opening verses of chapter 24, the first 3 verses, the apostles, who are stunned by what they've just been told, standing there as they were at the very place that was going to be left desolate, looking up at that temple towering above them. It says in verse 1, Jesus came out from the temple, was going away, when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. What are they pointing out? What are they thinking about? The temple buildings. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? These things, do you not see? Your eyes are beholding some things. And these things are what I'm talking about. What you see, what you're pointing out. Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. The stones will be torn down and they're still going to be right there in that area. But it's not the end of the planet, the solar system, the galaxy, or the universe. It's this location where those things will happen. So maybe 15 minutes later, as they crossed the Kidron Valley, got up on the Mount of Olives somewhere as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives. That's why this is called the Olivet Discourse. The disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So he had said to them, do you not see all these things? They were pointing at all these things. These things were going to be left to them desolate. These things would not have one stone left on another. Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? You have one sentence with 3 clauses that we needed to sort out. So Matthew 24, verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him saying, tell us, when will these things happen, comma, and what will be the sign of your coming, comma, and of the end of the age? I asked you for weeks, make a decision. How many questions? There are only 2 interrogatives out of the entire list of who, what, where, when, why, and how. And really, who needs to also have a corollary in to whom. These are the only interrogatives that exist in our English language, or I suppose in anybody else's. And they'll help you understand how many questions are being asked. The when question was asked first. The what question was asked after that. The when question has only 1 clause. When will these things happen? The what question has 2 clauses. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Maybe I should say 2 phrases. I'm not sure there. But there's only 1 what question that has 2 parts to it. So then, if I were to come to you and, listen to you for a minute and you claim to be a prophet and you'd said, Larry, after a year of remodeling your home and all the effort and money that you've poured into it, and you all know that's what I've been doing for a year on this house. When I'm not preparing these lessons, I'm wielding a hammer. If somebody came, into my yard and said to me my house was going to be left to me desolate, and not, one nail here was going to be left connected to any 2x4, if he told me the whole thing was going to be torn down, would you expect me to turn to him and say, "End of the age"? Is that a question? Is that even a complete thought? That is not a third question. It needs an interrogative. It's a part of the second question. Now, I mentioned Tim LaHaye before, and I want you to notice also this name, Thomas Ice. In my not so humble opinion, I would say that those two men have perhaps done more damage to the cause of Christ than anybody since Billy Graham. These men have all promoted false doctrine. I don't know that they did it consciously, but when the blind lead the blind, they both fall in the ditch. I don't know how they got there. I never met any of those three men. But those three men have misled millions. And so have all, their disciples that preach the stuff that they do. And these two, when it comes to eschatology, have been particularly destructive. So here's this book, Charting the End Times, written by Tim LaHaye, who is the author and mastermind behind the Left Behind books and movies, and then Thomas Ice. They are, purporting to have a visual guide to understanding Bible prophecy in this excellent book, which in a masterful way charts out page after page every one of their magnificent mistakes. So here's the chapter that's entitled The Olivet Discourse. Likely you won't be able to read that. I'll go ahead and go full screen for you here. But I'm going to highlight the very first sentence on Matthew 24 and its corollaries, and then put it up on the screen so you can actually read it. They say in the first sentence on Matthew's Olivet Discourse, the Olivet Discourse delivered shortly before Jesus' crucifixion, it's a few days away, is the most important single passage of prophecy in all the Bible. Well, I don't know about that. Maybe it's so. It's certainly an important one. They've pegged it as being more important than all of Revelation, I guess, but the single biggest one in all the book. Then they add to this under the title, The Disciples' Questions, they say, the Olivet Discourse is a response to 3 questions asked by the disciples. Pardon me, that's Opie calling me, from Mayberry. That's my phone's ringtone. So the Olivet Discourse is a response to 3 questions asked by the disciples. 3 questions they contend. And they list them at the bottom of the first column here, and then the next 2 at the top of the other column. They list them exactly like this. I'm putting them on the screen the way they put them in the book. When will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming? What will be the sign of the end of the age? Now you'll notice as they list these questions, they've left the ends out, and they've listed them as altogether full sentences with question marks at the end, as if that's what actually happened. But it isn't. It's scripturally wrong. That isn't what happened. What happened was what we see. They've added 5 words to replace the word "and." What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age is a single question that's part 2 of a single sentence. What will be the sign? The sign of the coming is the sign of the end of the age. Jesus, the Son of Man, is coming to end the age. This is just scripturally incorrect. They're reading it improperly. It doesn't say what they've made out of it. That's point number 1. But I'll put the words back up on the screen because it is true that what will be the sign goes with both of your coming and of the end of the age. It's incorrect to think of this as a third separate question that is about a totally different subject that's at least 2 millenniums away from the first subject. It is utterly mistaken to try to turn this into 2 wondrously different concepts and topics and subjects and events and to maintain that it's prophesying about things that are separated by at least 2,000 years. That's just wrong. But if you understand that what will be the sign of your coming is the sign of the end of the age, well then yeah, you can restate it as what will be the sign of the end of the age, but you must recognize there's only one sign for the coming and the end of the age, and that one sign isn't cut in the middle with 2,000 years. So it's grammatically wrong. There's only two questions. We diagrammed this sentence last week. When is the first question? I'm still not sure. None of my grammar teachers, have told me whether that when goes up above or down below like that. But there's only one question. I'm not quite sure which line it belongs on. But then you have the conjunction and. So when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The topic has never changed. Only two questions have been asked about the coming desolation and the removal of these stones in that generation. This and, the second and, takes the one sign. It's not plural. There is no S on the end. Takes the one sign as being indicative of two things that take place concurrently. When the Son of Man comes, the age will end. The Son of Man comes at the end of the age. When the Son of Man comes, an age, not a world, not a solar system, galaxy, or universe, an age, a time frame, is coming to an end. That is just grammatically wrong to see three questions on two different subjects in these three verses. And I've invented a new word. It is synoptically wrong. We pointed this out last week. Mark, the parallel, the corollary, the other place where a gospel writer records this same event, knows of no third question. As Mark 13, verses 3 and 4 stipulate, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Now we're told which four men particularly wanted to ask this question. They were questioning him privately. Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? These things have been very carefully delineated. They all revolve around events that will take place in that generation that those people will witness. And as we've seen throughout Matthew in chapter after chapter, they are things that will take place before every member of that generation dies. And there'll be some other time references we've already seen that we'll look at again here in just a minute. Luke 21, another corollary to Matthew 24, Luke's account of the exact same event. 21 verses 7 through 8 says, when therefore will these things happen, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? So, you've got the light blue. They both have, when will these things be, and when therefore will these things happen? The purple, they both have, what will be the sign? What will be the sign? And in green, when all these things are going to be fulfilled and when these things are about to take place. The other gospel writers were not led by the Spirit of God to suggest that there's a third question. And that's because Matthew wasn't led to indicate one either. There are only two questions. And they're all about these things, these things, these things, these things. We haven't changed the topic when they ask these two questions. It's synoptically. Synoptic means seen together. The three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. I'm presuming you probably know that. And so, in the Synoptics, there's only two questions. And I'm maintaining it as contextually wrong, as we will have proven once I finish Matthew 24. There isn't any place where Jesus changes horses in the middle of his Jordan River here about the desolation that's coming in their generation. But I've got to flesh that out over the next few weeks. And then eschatologically, in the study of last things, the entire doctrine of premillennialism, every aspect of it with very rare exceptions, is just absolutely wrong everywhere else in your Bible as well. So I've given you 5 reasons why, and 2 of these will be developing as the weeks go by and throughout the book of Revelation, that this idea of Jesus coming back any day now. They've always said for hundreds of years and been wrong. The Jehovah's Witnesses have been wrong several times. The Adventists have been wrong more than once. The Baptists have been wrong now, and all the rest of them. It doesn't happen. So we're going to be reading about Matthew 24's end of the age, not any day now, but in the time frame when it was given, in that generation. Matthew 24, verse 3, there are only 2 questions asked. They're only involving one topic. And if, in fact, there's more than one topic, we'll have to find the transition in Matthew 24. So tonight, we're going to move right on, and you keep, your antenna up, looking for that transition. Where does Jesus stop talking about the things they saw, they pointed at, the stones that were here that wouldn't be left upon another in this generation, both before and after their questions? Where's the transition to something else? So, Revelation 1, verses 1 through 3. And pardon me again, here comes that inevitable cough. And then the necessary and concomitant crossing of the Beatles on Abbey Road. There they go. And we come to Revelation 1, 1 through 3. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his bondservants the things which must soon take place. And then skipping to verse 3, for the time is near. That's how this book of Revelation begins. In 1:7 of Revelation, only 4 verses later, he is coming with the clouds. Every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth, much more to come on that word for earth, will mourn over him. Even so, amen. And I pointed out last week, we're studying Matthew 24 because Revelation is built on it. In fact, I'd say it's the cornerstone. It's not just a foundation, it is the cornerstone of Revelation. If you don't understand Matthew 24 correctly, you must necessarily fail to grasp what Revelation's cornerstone and therefore all the rest of the structure is built on. Matthew 24:30 says the same thing Revelation 1:7 says. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven, that is, that the Son of Man is in heaven, that sign that shows he's in heaven, will appear. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Once again, I color-coded it. Both of them have the Son of Man coming on/with the clouds. Both of them have every eye seeing him, even those who pierced him. They will see the Son of Man. And each of them sees the tribes of the earth mourning because of it. The tribes of the earth will grieve when they see Jesus coming with the clouds. Matthew 24 says they will. Revelation 1:7 begins a whole book on the demonstration that Matthew 24 and Revelation are parallel topics. Matthew 24:30 and Revelation 1:7 have the same component parts. But Matthew 24:30 is followed 4 verses later with the statement that all these things will take place in this generation. And Revelation began by telling us these things are soon and near and shortly to come to pass. I have the etc. because the 22nd chapter ends that way also. So, let me start some new material denial, and I'm already, tonight I'm already almost halfway through. Here is a harmony of the Gospels by Robert L. Thomas and Stanley N. Gundry, which I did not put in my recommended list of reading in the first pages there of the syllabus. But this is one of my top 5 Bible study tools. If you don't have this in your home, then you're crippling yourself in the study of the Gospels. I know of no tool that's more effective and helpful than this one. The cover is blue in the New American Standard Version. That's the version I recommend. And it is kind of rough to the touch, so you can see that's a pretty accurate representation of what the cover looks like. Here's my own personal copy, now heavily marked up after many years. And if I can go ahead and hold it up for you, here's that same book, but you can see that I've had it rebound. I've put my own name on it, and I've rebound it, so that all my notes are readily available. But I added a New American Standard Bible in those blue pages. I added the New American Standard there as a ready reference. Spent a fortune on this, but it's just magnificently important to see the Gospels in columns. And I had a great conversation this morning, I think it was, with a fine Bible student and preacher here in Sumner. I'm trying to hide everybody's names, but really a good guy. And he's made his own now, and he was sharing it with me. He's gone through, taken Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, arranged them in parallel columns so that he can see then in the Synoptic Gospels everything that Jesus said on all of that. When you do that, you'll begin to recognize why the Thomas Ices, Tim LaHaye's and Hal Lindsey's and Billy Graham's of the world, are sticking to Matthew 24. By ignoring Mark and Luke, it's easier to pull a wool over people's eyes and lead them down the primrose path to premillennialism, the idea that Jesus is coming back to live on the earth again for a literal 1,000 years in a rebuilt temple, which is scripturally impossible. So if you could study them all at the same time, right on the same page, there's a great deal of insight that just now presents itself to you. So I want to strongly recommend you buy this particular book, A Harmony of the Gospels, by Robert L. Thomas. So he's got two first names. And then Stanley N. Gundry, Gundry. I think it's far better translation than New American Standard, but it is also available in the New International Version. Get the New American, it's a much more literal translation. But now, I want to focus on the footnotes. I love this work, top 5. But they're still premillennialists. And so, the footnotes, you have to be really careful with. I'm going to blow this one up for you. In parenthesis, they start off this second footnote on that page with a quote or the reference to Matthew 24:3, Mark 13:4, and Luke 21:7. Those are the question verses. And now I'll read it for you. The disciples apparently asked 3 questions, they say. The first pertained to the destruction of the temple, which subsequently happened in 70 AD at the hands of the Roman army. Well, amen! Everybody knows that's there. It's just that some people aren't content to accept that that's all that's there. So they've invented a third question in a whole new way, to wander off and see something else in these words. But watch what they now say. Another of these questions pertain to Jesus' future personal return and the consummation of the age associated with it. Then they say, though separated by many years. And I'm asking you, where's the transition? Where does it go from these things that are in this generation to things that are thousands of years away? So they just assert it. Though separated by many years, the two events are closely related in that both are part of God's ongoing program for the people of Israel. The other question related to the sign when these things, and they've got it in quotes, probably the destruction of the temple, well, amen, were about to happen. Yeah, because Jesus said they were about to happen. The disciples assumed, did they, that the destruction of the temple would be the prelude to Messiah's return to consummate the age and initiate his kingdom on earth. Well, they didn't have to assume that. That's what he said he was going to do. But then they say Jesus did not deny a relationship between the two events. Now they've inserted, like they do in Daniel, in chapter 2, between the shin bones and the ankles are going to stick 2,000 years in there, which Daniel never did. They say Jesus did not deny a relationship between two events that they teach are 2,000 years apart. Well, of course, Jesus did not deny a relationship between the two events because they're the same event. There's only one event. Then they continue, nor did he in the subsequent discourse, in all the rest of Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, they say, nor did he in the subsequent discourse reveal the long interval that would separate the two. Well, thank you for agreeing with me that there's no such thing as an interval, let alone long, in Matthew 24, Mark 13, or Luke 21. I accept your concurring with my proposition then that Billy Graham, Tim LaHaye, and Thomas Ice are dead wrong. And I'm thinking that Gundry and Thomas will prove it if you get the book and you start looking at these next to each other. There's no long interval in any one of the three synoptic gospels on the Olivet Discourse, and they know it. But they're going to put it in there anyway. Now, brethren, you know, your doctrinal convictions can overwhelm you. Otherwise, brilliant scholars can make terrible mistakes. Honestly, I'm not saying they're dishonest. Maybe they are, but I don't know that they are. But they're wrong nonetheless. Jesus did not deny a relationship between the two events because there weren't two events. Nor did he in the subsequent discourse reveal the long interval that would separate the two. That's because there is no interval for him to reveal. Some predictions were fulfilled a few years after he spoke the words, but others have as yet to be fulfilled, they claim. As yet to be fulfilled. E.g., for example, they put Matthew 24:30. This footnote on the two questions in Matthew 24 verse 3 has contended that there are three questions on two totally different topics with a 2,000 year and counting interval, and Matthew 24:30, they say, is an as yet to be fulfilled prophecy. Can you see my handwritten note on the page over there in the lower right? But see Matthew 24:34. Here's what it says 4 verses later and why Jesus doesn't speak of any interval. This generation will not pass away until all these things except verse 30 take place. Yes or no? Did he 4 verses later accept, exempt, leave out, deny verse 30 when he said in verse 34, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place? That paragraph as a footnote to the inspired writing, which decidedly proves otherwise, the footnote claims there's 3 questions on 2 topics, and there is not. And brethren, we must not add to the Scriptures. We must not take away from the Scriptures. We must be interpreters by way of exegesis, getting out what was put there, and not eisegesis, putting in like a 2,000 year interval that they admit Jesus never did. So now let's read the first 14 verses of Matthew chapter 24. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he answered and said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly, I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another which will not be torn down. And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. And you'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for these things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations on account of my name. And at that time, many will fall away and will deliver up one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise, will mislead many. And because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached, I repeat, in the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. Now, for the remaining 30 minutes of our class time this evening, we're going to look at these verses 4 through 14. Twice now I have been extremely repetitious. Tonight was the second time. Now I'm warning you. We've been working in some pretty fairly great detail in these studies. I told you I was going to treat you like adults. If you couldn't hang on with me, that's okay. Go back to an elementary level, start reading, keep working with the introduction, but I've got to teach this at a higher level. And I'm encouraged to do so. As I said, cards, letters, phone calls, and everything, just overwhelmingly positive. And thank you. We're well over twice as many students as I've ever taught this to before. The number just keeps growing. But for Matthew 24, I'm going to go down, to a microscopic level, and we're going to tear this apart until we get every word right. It's the cornerstone of the book of Revelation. If we're wrong here, we're probably 22 chapters wrong in God's grand finale. We're going to miss the whole point of the last book that is in Revelation and is Revelation. So next couple of weeks, including tonight, really down to a molecular level here we're going to bore in. Stick with me, baby. The best is yet to come. But it's challenging, and it's a college level stuff. So here we've just seen Jesus' choice as the master teacher in answering the two questions about the end of the age and not the end of the world. You remember our word study. Last week we got into these word studies. An age was ending, not a planet. What the sign is not is in verses 3 through 13. They asked when and what sign. He chooses to set all the mistakes apart first and tell them what the sign is not. So what the sign is not in verse 5 is having a whole lot of false Christs. What the sign is also not in verse 6 and 7 is wars and rumors of wars. A proliferation of wars is not the sign. Verse 7, there'll be famines and earthquakes, and they are not the sign. In verse 9, it's not the tribulation, it's not the murder, it's not the hatred, it's not the apostasy, it's not the betrayal, it's not the more hatred in verse 10. The many false prophets are repeated from verse 5 and verse 11. Their deception is listed, and in verse 12 you have lawlessness, love growing cold, most people's love, in fact. But verses 3 through 13 is what the sign is not. They want to know what is the sign of the coming of the Son of Man to end the age. What is the sign of the Son of Man's coming and the end of the age? And it's not those things. Now, of course, if you're listening to the popular teachers of today, the ones who have hundreds of thousands, even millions of followers, entire denominational groups have been built on this, growing out of the 1800s with the Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists in particular. And they, all of them, just wax eloquent and passionate and more energetic than I do and more vehement than I'll ever get, in the most florid language you can imagine. We can see all these things in our newspapers. They're happening in our headlines right now, they told us. in the middle of the 1800s. Then later in the 1800s when they tried to correct their mistake. And then in the 1900s, time and time again. And already in the first 20 years of the 21st century, they've failed more than once. So they keep rewriting the books and redoing it, but they're always saying, any day now, see, because here's the signs. And what had Jesus just told them? The sign is not any of those things. It just amazes me how you can get carried away with insanity to deny the text once you predetermine what you want to get out of it, so that you could even go so far as to add a third question. Now in Matthew 24 verses 3 through 13, not only are these things not the sign, but here's what the disciples are not to do about those things. They are not to be misled by them in verse 4. They are not to be frightened by them in verse 6. And they're given the reason why. That's because in verse 8, this is just the beginning. These things, they'll have to go through all these things before those living people in that generation, before they all die, but in a time frame long enough that some of them will. In that time frame, they're going to see all those things that are not the sign be the beginning that would lead up to the sign when the end would in fact come. And in these verses 3 through 13, here's what they should be doing. In verse 13, enduring to the end. But the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. Now, for those of you who took me up on my offer and the links I provided to listen to the two Bible classes from 1975 in Denver, Colorado, taught by Ed Wharton, if you went through those two classes this week, then you will be as smitten as I was with Ed saying, this is not salvation from sin. This is salvation of skin. The salvation we're talking about, enduring to the end and being saved, is the salvation of your life, your physical life. And we spent a bit of time in Matthew 16 on that, didn't we? Last few verses of Matthew 16. I didn't review that tonight, probably should have. Go back to Matthew 16. But now look at this. In Matthew 24:13, we just read it, the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. But we've read that exact idea somewhere else. Verbatim. Precisely the same words we've read somewhere else. Where do we read that? We read that a couple of weeks ago in Matthew 10, verses 22 and 23. Matthew 10:22 says, it is the one who has endured to the end who will be saved. But exactly like Matthew 24, which at verse 34 proclaims that the end he's talking about in verse 13 will happen in that generation. It's one of the things that is in the all things that will happen in that generation. Just like Matthew 24:13, Jesus gave a time reference in Matthew 10. 23 says, whenever they persecute you in one city, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. It is the coming of the Son of Man to end the age, brethren, to bring about all these things, the desolation of the house, not one stone left on another. And it's going to happen through a time of terrible tribulation that is the beginning of the end. They will live to see the end before the apostles could preach in every city in a tiny little country on the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean Sea. Before they would die. In that generation, those men would, some of them, live to see the end and be saved with a lot of other Jews if they'll do what Jesus tells them to do prior to verse 34, which we'll be studying next week. Now, for now, though, in these last 15 minutes, I want to spend some time. I told you this is going to be really granular tonight. On God's time references now, in answer to the questions, two of them in verse 3, running through verses 4 through 13. You. You know, after a while, a person might get the idea that Jesus was talking to him, and Jesus was talking to them. And it might even be that if we're reading this 2,000 years later, we're not sitting on the Mount of Olivet looking out at the temple he had just declared would be destroyed. We might be making a mistake if we took all these yous to be talking about us 2,000 years later. But if we demand that they're talking about us, there's a simple solution, brethren. You just have to insert 2,000 years into Matthew 24 and then hunt in vain for some transition from AD 70 destruction, which everybody admits is there, to Jesus jumping off his horse and swimming through the water to get on a different one that'll be discussing things 2,000 years later. These U's won't let you do it. There are 20 of them. I've counted them in Matthew 24. Jesus kept saying to those disciples, his apostles, particularly to the 4 who had asked the question. We can't tell if the rest were listening to the answer or only the 4. It does say privately. So I'm not sure how many people were hearing this, but at least 4. And then it's inspired and recorded for us. But the you, 20 of them is you guys that I'm talking to here on this hill as we gaze down on the Temple Mount, which will be left desolate when it's destroyed at the end of the age in my coming. So that's a time reference, number 1. Then you have all these things shall come upon this generation. In chapter 23, verse 36, and in chapter 24, verse 34, which makes a great bracket, and we must remain inside those parameters and perimeters, those limiters. We are not permitted by the God of heaven to just ignore, set aside, and jump the fence. He is putting all this information, unbroken discussions from a Temple Mount sermon, a conclusion about the desolation of the temple, a short walk down one side of the hill and up the other onto Olivet, and the disciples perhaps terrified, horrified, but certainly very intensely interested in curious questions. When will all these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And we've been told before and after that it's in this generation. Now that's just a fact. So there's a second time reference. It's unmistakable. But here's Matthew 24 now, verse 14, a third time that's on the when. Jesus tells them now the answer to the first question, the when question. Here's the direct answer. Don't be misled by 11 verses of all this other stuff. You're going to hear a whole lot about Left Behind and, late grade Planet Earth. And these guys, are going to be really popular. Don't believe a word of that. Because Jesus was talking about all those things in the generation they were standing in, every one of which has been verified in history, written in those ages, and preserved down to this day, I believe, by the God of heaven, who providentially wanted us to have the historical proof that every one of those things in verses 4 through 13 did take place in the first generation and are not in the least bit, including the earthquakes. It's a big favorite of everybody. There have been more earthquakes at numerous times in the past than we're having now. And don't let anybody just blow and go about how you just ought to believe them that there is. Well, there's not. And I've done some of that research to confirm it. It is not true that we're having more earthquakes today than ever before. It is not true. They just say so. And you're supposed to go, okay, put the ring in my nose. I'll just believe it. There must be more earthquakes because you say there are. You went to college. You got a degree. You wrote a book. But he doesn't know what he's talking about because he's promoting a doctrine that means more to him than what the scriptures say. Here's God's time reference in 24:14. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world. The Greek word is oikumene, for world. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole oikumene, for a witness to all the nations. and then the end shall come 2,000 years later. Huh? This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then 2,000 years later the end shall come? No. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached for 2,000 years before it finally gets in the whole world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come? Does this verse say what they make out of it? How it's twisted and abused and mangled and used and turned and just wrecked to promote a false doctrine? None of that is true. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world. Whatever the Greek word oikumene means, and you're about to find out, for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. Now, he's already told them they have to endure to that end. He's going to tell them 20 verses later it's going to happen in this generation. He's already told them in 23:36 it'll happen in this generation. We've got you 20 times. And they're only talking about one subject. When's the temple coming down? It'll come down when the kingdom, the gospel of the kingdom, has been preached in the entire oikumene. What does oikumene mean? Well, in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all of planet Earth. Right? Isn't the word world? Well, no. Now it's translated inhabited earth. Because they know it's not talking about the whole planet. They know Caesar Augustus couldn't send out people to get a census of the whole planet. They weren't in the whole planet. They didn't control the whole planet. Rome was tiny compared to the whole planet. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of the oikumene. And that is the area ruled by Rome in this context and absolutely nothing else. Don't you be adding to Scripture. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Oikumene, in the first century Bible, in this passage, is referring to the boundaries that Caesar Augustus controlled and could work a census in. In Acts chapter 17 and verse 6, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the authorities, shouting, "These men who have upset 7 continents have come here too." Oh, really? So first they went to South America, then they went to North America, covered Australia, a couple of cold places in the north and south, and all of Europe, you know what I mean? Where are these continents? These men who have upset the whole oikumene, who haven't gotten through the cities of Israel yet, have come here also. What does oikumene mean in Acts 17:6? It means everywhere the gospel has gone by the time you get into Acts chapter 17. Paul's second journey. Well, already, brethren, they're being accused of having upset the whole oikumene, which is when the end comes, gospel preached in it, Matthew 24:14. What? That was Acts 17. Here's Acts 19:27. There is danger this trade of ours fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the Eskimos worship will even be dethroned. Brethren, there were no Eskimos worshiping Artemis. Artemis, the local god of the Ephesians, was a very popular goddess in the Roman Empire, but not outside of the Roman Empire. Unknown anywhere else. Certainly not on 6 other continents. Brethren, we've got problems when we just allow people, because they got a PhD or wrote a book, to say, well, the gospel's never been preached around the whole planet. I think I could find, some natives back in the jungle of Borneo that haven't heard it yet. Baloney. Now here's Acts 24, verse 5. We have found this man a real pest and a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the oikumene. Well, how far has this pest Paul gotten? Really? Sydney, Australia already? I don't think so. So when people start arguing, that this gospel in the whole world hasn't happened yet, Matthew 24 cannot apply to this statement. When they start denying all these things will take place in this generation, they are stubbornly stiffening their necks against the Lord of glory who saved us on a cross and saying, Jesus, I don't believe you. Not all these things happen in this generation because I say so. Never mind, Jesus, what you say. Now, brethren, they may not be doing this consciously. Some people are so blind, it is just awesome. They can't even see the inside of their eyelids. And so, oikumene has been made to mean a lot more than it ever did in Scripture. What is an oikumene? That when the gospel of this kingdom is preached in it, then the end will come before this generation ends, Matthew 24:34. In Josephus' Wars of the Jews, which I've recommended so highly, I was singing his praises in a phone call this afternoon. Another one of my students here on this class, called me up about it. I recommended Gallia Kornfeld, G-A-A-L-Y-A, Kornfeld, C-O-R-N-F-E-L-D, has far and away, unparalleled, no peers, best translation of Josephus' Wars of the Jews ever. You usually pick it up for $40 or less on Amazon in the used, books. Get a copy. Herod Agrippa, with the eyewitness of Josephus in 66 A.D., pleaded with the Jews in Jerusalem to give up. And in the course of that discourse, in Wars 2:16-4, pardon me again. I have to get me a humidifier or something in here. He said this. He said, the might of the Roman Empire, now that's the subject. You can see the 3 dots there. I'm going to cut some out, but I give you the quote or the reference. The might of the Roman Empire is what he's talking about. And then he says, shortly later, their arms have been invincible over the whole oikumene. Nay, they even desired for more than this oikumene, the Euphrates as their frontier in the east, the Ister, which we call the Danube River, in the north. That's the one that borders on Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, and Moldova. Libya in the south, Josephus adds his third point of the compass definition. Then the last is Gades, which is Spain, in the west. He continues, they've sought a new oikumene. But I don't think they're getting on a spaceship, brethren. Josephus says they've sought a new oikumene beyond the ocean and carried their arms as far as Britain, unknown previously to history, end quote. Did you know there was more than one oikumene? That there was more than one world? Had you asked yourself which oikumene would the gospel of the kingdom and preached in as a testimony to them and the nations? Have you asked yourself which one it was? Most people don't know to do that. Josephus would have. So that's a pretty eye-opening statement, isn't it? Now look at this, brethren. In Matthew 24:14, we are told when the end shall come. and that you need to endure to the end of it in order to be saved in that generation 20 verses later. Acts 2 verses 5 through 11 says this: There were Jews living in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, the crowd came together, were bewildered because each of them was hearing them speak in his own language. Brethren, here every nation under heaven is the extent of the Jews, which so far as we know hadn't got very far outside the boundaries of the Roman Empire. In Romans 1 verse 8, sorry, I went too far, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. But this time it's not oikumene, it's cosmos. Another word that fairly can be translated world, a different one. But Romans 8 says the gospel of the kingdom by way of their faith has already gone there in 57 AD when Romans was written. Here's Romans 10:18. I say, surely they've never heard, have they? Indeed they have. Their voice has gone out into all the oikumene, and their words to the ends of the world. And this time the Greek word is gay or geis. I've given up trying to get accurate representations of the actual Greek. My friend there, the native-born Greek speaker, keeps helping me with it, but I'm having some kind of font issues, so I won't try to do it in Greek, but I'm just doing a phonetic, there for you. So, but here's oikumene, brethren, and Paul emphatically declares that the voice has already gone out into all of it in 57 AD and to the ends of the world too. Now we've had cosmos, nations under heaven, gay, and oikumene, and all of them asserting that the gospel of the kingdom's already been there. In Colossians chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, it's 5 years later than the Roman letter. It's now 62 AD, likely 3 to 4 years before the book of Revelation will be written and sent. I tried to say sent and written at the same time. Written and then sent. You previously heard in the word of truth, the gospel, verse 6, which has come to you just as in all the world, cosmos this time, also it is constantly bearing fruit and increasing. Brethren, I do not believe the gospel was being preached in Tahiti in 62 AD. I don't know anybody else who does. But as the verbiage was used in the first century, which is the way we ought to use it, instead of the way Billy Graham and Thomas Ice and Tim LaHaye and Hal Lindsey and all the rest of these enthusiasts who've made many millions that, I wish I had. They sure made a lot of money, but they didn't have a clue what they were talking about. They say it hasn't happened. These passages say it has. Here's 21 through 23, though I'm just going to be looking at a small portion of those 4 verses there. Or, what is that? 3 verses, I guess. He's giving an admonition now in Colossians 1, closer to the end of that first chapter. Continue in the faith, firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, past tense, which was proclaimed, also a completed action, in all creation under heaven. You don't have oikumene there. You don't have gay there, or its other form, geis, or cosmos. All creation under heaven. Well, maybe it is in Tahiti then. Maybe the Eskimos have heard the gospel. Maybe we just don't have the historical record, and it's gone to all 7 continents by other men while the apostles were trying to finish up in Israel, and in a single generation, without so much as a steamship to get you there. Maybe so. But if so, brethren, then the when the end shall come had covered the whole planet by 62 AD when the Colossian letter was written. So fine. My view is that these expressions are referring to the world of the apostles and the Jews of that time, and that all these expressions can fairly be limited to their world at that time, the world they lived in at that time. But brethren, you could take them in their most extreme absolute sense, and all it would prove is that I'm right and all these other guys are wrong, because in 57 and 62 AD, we are told it had been to all of those expressions, every last one of them. So whatever they mean, they were finished so that the end could come in that generation. The desolation, not a stone on another, could come. And it did. Matthew 24:15 now will tell you what the sign is. Read, and read some more. Matthew chapter 24. I'll begin as I ended. I love you people. Thank you for being so determined. You're going to love what is to come. See you next week, I hope.